What is going on, everybody? This is Black Apino, the Apple Guy, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the GoPros that have been out for the last couple of months. There's been a lot of people who have bought or purchased GoPros, and they bought various models. As you can tell, the new ones. If you're not familiar with the newer lines of GoPros, these replace, I believe, last year's models. They came out sometime during. I'm not sure if it was during the fall, I believe, because I had the 5 around the summertime. So they came out with newer versions of GoPros, which really aren't really that much new. Somewhat of a body design difference between two of them, and then they completely replaced the high end with a new version, which actually is a much better version than their previous version. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But primarily, what I wanted to talk about was everybody wants to know what's the best settings for their GoPro. How can I get my GoPro to look the best or better than someone else's? What do I need to do to make my video stand out among everyone else, or to make it look better than what I've seen with my previous GoPros? And for that, that's primarily what I want to talk about. Obviously, you know, if you've been paying attention to GoPro, they have the GoPro Hero, the 5 and the 7, which they now call the Hero White, the Hero Silver, and the 7 Black. The differences between the Hero and its previous and the White is not much really, other than they removed the LCD screen from the front of the Heroes, which I'm not exactly sure why. They actually did it with both the White and the Silver. I'm not really sure why they did that. I kind of like seeing the amount of time that I have on my GoPro, as well as what's the size of whatever file, whatever SD card I have in there. I might not have enough space to be doing a lot of videos. I like to see that. And then also battery power, because you really can't tell how much battery power you have until all of a sudden your GoPro just shuts off. At least with the screen on the front, the LCD screen on the front actually gives you kind of a representation of your battery. I'm not exactly sure why GoPro kind of just stopped doing that with the silver and the white, but they kept it on the 7. So that's just an oddity to me. I don't know, maybe when they come up with a newer lineup, they'll put that back in. I think they should. It makes it much more easier than you having to switch the battery back, or then you're not sure, and then you just kind of pull it out and then charge it when it doesn't really need to be charged. And then when you don't think it needs to be charged, it needs to be charged. And then you're just kind of stuck there with the GoPro because you don't have any other battery to buy. You don't have another battery, or both batteries are just almost dead. So, but back to my original thought. About settings. There's been a lot of people out there trying to figure out what's the best settings for my computer or for my GoPro. Should I shoot everything in 4K at 60, 24, 30? Or should I be shooting it at 1080, at 120, 60, 24? What about that hyper smooth? Should I be using that? Should I get the 7? Should I get the 5? What's the differences? And I just really want to kind of address that because it's like a twofold thing with GoPros. Obviously, I have the GoPro 7 Hero Black, and I shoot everything I have in 4K, but my computer is capable of doing 4K because my iMac is a 4K iMac, as well as it having a dedicated graphics card. I've learned in the past that when it comes to doing video editing, especially if you don't have a solid state in your desktop or in a laptop, it makes it very difficult for you to run any type of programs, especially if you're shooting them at much higher frame rates and high resolutions, because it tends to make the program slow and sluggish. And you really don't want that when you're editing, because when you're in the middle of cutting up something and then you finally get it cut up the way you want it after spending, a couple of hours doing it, then it freezes up on you, and then all of a sudden now you have to end up turning off your device and then re-going through the steps again, because because Adobe or Final Cut or whatever you're running, if you're running it on a regular hard drive, the programs are just so demanding nowadays that dedicated graphics card is kind of a must for any type of video editing. Now, I'm not going to dispute what anyone else on YouTube says about it, because everyone's going to be different. And most of the YouTubers, at least from what I've seen on the people that I follow, they all have high-end rigs. I wouldn't say that I have a high-end rig, but I do have an iMac, at least in my tier. It's their top tier 21-incher. That runs a dedicated 4 gigs of AMD 560 graphics card, and I'm running a solid state. And it cost me a pretty penny just to do that, but it was something that I needed, because originally I had bought the second version of the iMac. I bought it with 2 gigs of dedicated graphics, and it was running AMD's 550, and it had a regular SATA drive. And I learned then, when I was trying to run Adobe, that I was having a problem with it trying to keep up with my cutting up and just rendering programs or rendering off of Adobe, because my hard drive was just incapable of just keeping up with the program. It was always freezing on me. I ended up having to this program became unresponsive, and I just ended up having to cut it. So I just thought, well, I really should have gotten the one with the I should have just bought one with the Fusion drive. At least then I would have had a much better laptop than or desktop than what I had previously. And a Fusion drive just basically means that it's a hybrid drive, half solid state, half SATA drive. So the solid state portion would hold all the programs, while the SATA drive would do most of the work in that sense. So I just opted out for returning it. They didn't have the Fusion, so I just opted and spent a little bit more to get the solid state. And I've learned now that actually it runs a lot smoother now. I can actually do my video editing much better without my computer freezing up on me and my program locking up and me having to turn off and then restart or force restart it and then go through it all over again. It makes it for very unpleasantries. So when it comes to just base settings all in together, it's like I said, it's a twofold purpose. It's a twofold thing. Depending on the resolution of your computer screen. Now, a lot of people are going to want to use 4K video on a 1080 screen, and really you just can't do that because 4K can't go on a 1080. 1080 can do 4K. You can do 1080 on a 4K screen, but you can't do 4K on a 1080. So what would happen is that when you are doing your video editing, it's just going to render it down to a lower resolution. So for me, like when I'm doing my 4K editing like this, when I do my editing on this and my other GoPro images, although I shot those all in 1080, if I wanted to, I could bump that up resolution up to 4K and then do it and then encode it and stick it on YouTube in a 4K format. But then you have to realize that not everybody has a 4K computer. So when I shoot my videos, I just leave them all in 1080, and I usually do it either in 60 frames or 24 frames. But usually I just leave it in 60 frames just so people can actually see it, because you can't notice the difference between 720 at 60 versus 10 at 60. There's a little bit of difference, not too much, but it depends on how much video editing you do where you can notice the difference. So generally when I tell people who buy GoPros or who aren't really sure about settings, I usually tell you the best settings is going to be whatever you're using it for. So again, that really breaks down also what your computer can do. If your computer can't do 4K or the resolution of your computer's highest is 1080, then you do it at 1080, but see if you can get away with doing it at, say, 1080 at 60 frames, 1080 at 120. If you can't do 120 and you can do 60, then do it at 160. I actually have some footage that I took of my both GoPros. They're both 7s, but I have them down. One's in 1080 at 60 frames and one's at 1080 at 30 frames. And I just want to see if anyone can actually notice the difference between the two. I noticed the difference between them off the bat, but that's me because I've been using GoPros and have been doing this for quite a while. And then it also breaks down to where are you going to take it to use for your GoPro videos. Are you going to be in a place where there's a lot of scenery, or you can be doing it in your room where there's a lot of low light? What are you going to be doing with it? Again, it really depends on what you plan on doing with it, because it's not really going to be a specific setting for that one person, or that one setting fits all. It's always going to be different. So my advice on that would be to check out each setting. Just go around, even if it's just in your room, or if you're walking about in the summertime or whenever, wherever you're out where there's a lot of light, try the different low light settings and see what works for you. Once you figure out what's best for you, then you do that. But keep in mind that it's going to be changing every time you go with different scenes. So if you like to shoot a lot of stuff late at night, then you're going to have your auto light, low light on. If you're shooting in the morning, you're going to shoot it off. Obviously, there's going to be a difference between low light on and low light off. So then there's always going to be shutter speed and all that. And if you're not really sure what all that means, then don't even worry about it. Because again, if you're just starting to get into it, you'll be tearing your hair out just trying to figure out what to do or what's going to be the best settings for it. And by the time you're figuring out what to use, you're just not going to be interested in it. So I usually tell people the best setting is just keep it basic. 1080, 60 frames, and you're fine. Now, when it comes to field of view, that's also going to be different. Obviously, if you put it in linear, it means that it's going to be more closed in on you, kind of like a vlogging style when you're using a DSLR. And then when you're using wide or super view, wide just means it's a wider angle, so it gets you and a little bit of the background. And then there's super wide, which pretty much just gives you the whole view and everything that it can encompass within the lens that will show everything. So that's the difference between that. They just call that field of view, or FOV, which is what it's called on the GoPro. Then you're going to have what's known as a hyperstabilization, which is why I bought the 7, because I like that smooth video when I'm walking around. I've learned that in the long run, when I had the 5, when I look back at my footage, especially when I walk, it tends to back and forth, like kind of like an earthquake. You're just kind of going like back and forth, back and forth. I learned with hyper smooth, I can actually use that when in higher frame rates. Again, you can also do that in 1080 frame rates with your computer. You just need to have to be sure, is it something that you want? Because again, the differences between the 7 black and the silver, or the GoPro 5 if you want to call it, is the ability to have the hyper smooth. Otherwise, they both do 4K, just one does 4K at 60 while the other one does it at 30 frames a second. So I've actually made some video footage of the differences between 1080 at 30 and 1080 at 60, and I want to see if anyone can actually, tell the difference between the two. You can leave a comment in the comment section and tell me what's is different between the 30 and the 60. And then the hyper stabilization, I also made a video footage of that while I was at work, just to show the differences between hyper smooth versus just no stability at all on it. And then kind of make up your mind, do you want to pay $400 for the 7 for the ability to do the hyper stabilization, or spend the $299 and do it for the GoPro 5, which doesn't have it, but again still does the 4K stabilization. But also keep in mind that it depends on your computer, and if your computer can do 4K. If it can't, that's not saying you shouldn't get the 7, but I would suggest getting a much higher end laptop before you jump to the 7. That way when you do get it, then you can do your rendering at 4K, and you can upload that to YouTube in 4K, because you can actually upload in 4K. But if you have a 1080 screen, you really can't tell the difference between 4K at 60 or 4K versus 1080 versus a 60 or 1080 at 30. You just can't really tell the difference. So that's just my general consensus on that. I hope I'm not really confusing anybody on this. It's not really hard, honestly. It's just, it really breaks down to what you want. Is your computer rig capable of doing that? Again, when it comes to video editing, your programs, they're going to ask you for a minimum of at least 2 gigabytes of dedicated graphics. If you don't want to get something with dedicated graphics, you can still shoot stuff at 1080 at a lower frame rate, and you can still use those programs. Just keep in mind that they are very taxing, and it does good for you to actually get a laptop that's going to have a solid state and at least somewhat of a decent graphics card. If you're not really sure, I'd search on YouTube and say, what's the best minimum graphics card laptop that I can use to do video editing, and then just go from there. Again, like I said, I spent, for my iMac, the original, when I bought it, it was $1,200. That was for the middle tier, and then the higher end tier was $1,500 for that one, and that came with 4 gigs of RAM and a Fusion drive. So I spent just a little bit more than that, just shy of around $1,800-ish for mine, just to have a solid state in my laptop or desktop, and it runs fine because I have a combination of a solid state to run the program really well, and I have a dedicated graphics card that can handle the rendering of my 4K footage. So again, it really depends on what you plan to do with your GoPro. The best settings is always going to be what you think is, not what someone else thinks, because again, they may not be doing the same thing as what you're doing. You may be doing something different, and your scenes where you live versus where they live is always going to be different. So again, I hope I'm not really confusing anybody in this. If you have any questions, just drop a comment in the comment section below. And again, this is Black Apino, the Apple Guy. As always, feel free to browse my channel, like and subscribe, hit that notification bell so you know when I come up with some new content. And I'm going to be showing you some footage that I use with both my GoPro 7s, one at 60, one at 30. I'm probably not going to put which one is which until the end of the video for the differences between the 30 and the 60. but I will leave a caption for the stabilization versus the not stabilization, and then that way you can get a consensus on should I get it with stabilization or should I not, just so you can at least know what the differences are. So again, thanks to everybody. Have a good one.